This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to talk about how to maintain passion for your project. This came from one of our YouTube viewers' comments. Jayan, forgive me, I'm sure I just mispronounced that name, has really enjoyed developing characters, but then got to the world-building stage of development in an epic fantasy project and wants to know what can be done to maintain passion for a project in the long run. How can that passion be sustained when you go from planning the thing you love most, i.e. characters, to doing something you find less interesting, deciding upon the setting of the world? Even with some of the key characters planned, there's so much plot to be determined by choices in world development. Mm-hmm. All right. So do you find that you love some aspects of development and that others get you stuck, kind of grind the wheels to a halt or slow them down?
Yes.
Well, it doesn't really. I think that's one of the fascinating things about story, isn't it? Is that you've got to be prepared for that. And actually, what Stein's really asking is, how do you be a writer? Because in a way, you've got to deal with those complications to write an interesting story. And that's what probably draws us to it. And realistically, that's what draws readers, is readers are drawn in by, wow, how's this going to play out? And as a writer, sometimes you're writing and how's this going to play out? I've got no idea. I don't know, I've plotted it, but realistically, how the detail falls through, I'm not really sure. So I think sometimes you've kind of got to either, journal your way into it or experiment with a first draft, or get a developmental editor to look over your plot outline to clarify, apply a different model. So maybe if you've been following a very straightforward, say, 3-act play model, maybe you've got to go to something like the hero's journey and say, well, is there something in there I can pull out? Or perhaps you've got to look at Sean Coyne's Order versus Chaos, for example, and when can I throw chaos in that's either coincidental or causative, or so I do think we have a lot of tools to stoke our fire. And one of the things that personally, when that happens to me, what it means is I'm in a stuck state, and the best way to get out of a stuck state is to pattern interrupt. Now, whether that's go watch a movie that's related, or study a masterwork, or find a different model, which is why I mentioned that. That is one immediate thing, I think. Just from an overall global writer's point of view, you're always going to face those. So whether they're to do with, I love characters, but I hate setting, and so I'm stuck on setting, or whether it's the reverse, I love world building, but geez, I've got to develop this character and it's driving me crazy. I think we all have our blind spots in that way, and the important thing is not to get mired in them, because just because Tolkien wrote a masterpiece, he didn't do it overnight. It didn't just sort of vomit out Lord of the Rings and just get everything perfect. That's somebody who spent a detailed amount of time, as a professor would, carefully orchestrating it in a way that was just going to impress everybody. So anyway, I've just blurted stuff out there, and I do have some other ideas about it, but very specifically, but let me pass across to the others.
All right, Kathryn, you had a definitive yes when I asked the question, so I'll toss it to you.
Yep. I feel you with the fantasy world building pain. I am not the world's greatest world builder, and it does frustrate me on many occasions that I am not as excited about it as I feel like I should be. So I think for me, my biggest help is speaking it out loud with somebody else. So I don't know if you have anyone in your life, and they may not even care that you're writing a book, right? But if they're willing to dialogue with you, if you just start explaining like what's going on, what's in your world, what's happening, you're going to start finding the holes, but you're also going to start getting excited about it, because they're going to be like, wait, what? I don't understand. And then you're going to be like, but I can explain this. I can do this. And it generates a different level of passion because you're not just sitting at your computer, staring at a blank screen going, I need geography. You know, it changes the conversation dynamic. Mm-hmm. And if you can, if you can record it, I highly recommend recording it. Just pop open a voice memo on your phone, set it down between the two of you, and just go. Because you're going to come up with some really great stuff that you're going to be excited about, and then you can hang the rest of your world building on that you're excited about, or your characters, or your plot points, whatever kind of excites you in that moment and in that conversation. So that's where I love having my husband, who's a total fantasy nerd, in my corner, because he will just spitball with me for hours, and it's fantastic. So, yeah,
I think that's a really good. That's a great example of pattern interrupt again. So you know, it's a really, really good example. I like that because you're getting out of your head and out of Google and into something where the very act of expressing brings something to life, and that as writers is exactly what we do. And I think sometimes it's difficult when it's sitting, you know, it's rattling around in your brain and you can't express it, but when you're forced to with somebody else, it somehow creates an immediate clarification. Yeah, nice one. I like that.
Right. Well, and it also, like, we've talked a lot about changing your medium, right? So sitting, typing on a computer versus journaling versus speaking it out loud, it just changes the way your brain is thinking. So...
Well, I think that solved that problem. We can just, you know, end the episode there. That was, and I love how you sounded excited as you were talking about the process of getting excited about the process.
Right, exactly. Well, it is. I mean, you have to, it's a long haul, right? Especially if you're writing something that's very detailed or long, like an epic fantasy, like you're in it for a long time. So finding ways to make yourself excited about it is almost part of the game, right? Like Robert was saying, that's part of being a writer. You got to find a way to continue to generate that excitement so that you can sit in the chair and do the work.
Right. I actually love all of it. So don't hate me, but no, I think one way to get over those hurdles is instead of chunking it out all the time and saying, okay, I've got all of my characters, now I have to put them in a world. What does that world look like? You might do that to lay some foundations for your work, but then you've got to start weaving them together. So as I'm doing my world building, I'm thinking about the character in the world and how they interact, and you know, what kind of a job do I want my character in? And if it's a waitressing job versus a factory job, how is that going to affect my plot and my character's life? Who is she going to encounter? What kind of hours does she need to keep? What is the pay like? What are the dangers inherent in that kind of work? You know, you might have like machinery that could take off your arm, or you know, people who want to start a strike. Can you tell what I'm working on right now? Or you might have, you know, yes. It's not present day. You know, or waitressing, there might be sort of predatory men coming into the diner trying to take advantage of you. Yes, trying to take off your arm, all kinds of things. And so thinking about how these set pieces, the setting details, are going to affect my character's life and who she meets and what role she plays in the world she's in shapes my world building and makes it much more exciting, because then it isn't just about the geography or the buildings or the weather.
Yeah, and that was one of the other things I was going to come back to, is where the way the world affects your characters is why we have world building. And I can't think of any other reason, really, because otherwise you're just reading a travelogue. And what I think people get caught up in is I need to have the detail of, you know, how the architecture works, or how, you know, the cities are laid out, or I need someone to do a map for me at the front of the book. And largely those are all irrelevant. If the story is great, readers won't care, for one. The aficionados want them, yes, and so I'm not saying don't do it, but it isn't your starting point for story, because it has little to do with it. The thing that I think is probably important, as you've alluded to, Alida, as well, is that overall character motivation. What are the conflicts and obstacles and complications they're going to face, and how is it that the world has contributed to that? Those are things that I get stuck on sometimes. Is writing sci-fi is not dissimilar, because in some way you're inventing politics and global conflicts, maybe even interstellar conflicts, and you've got to have half a mind on why those are in place and what's going on behind the scenes. Because otherwise you might find yourself 4 books into a series and thinking, well, where's the conflict? I'm constantly reinventing the same thing for the character, which we've touched on before. Whereas if you do have an overarching... So I do think it's important to have, maybe to know what your magic rules are and to know what your overarching societal classes are, perhaps. But that's probably about as far as I would say you might need to go when you're first thinking about your overall series arc. And then the rest you can probably do, on the fly is probably not right, but it depends on whether you're writing, 3 books before publishing, for example. It's obviously easier if you're away into a series. You can backtrack and seed in things at the start. Something else that occurred to me as well, just from the point of view of breaking state, I was reading something just the other day. It was a book about how we forget that some of the prolific geniuses of the world didn't work full time on their creative output. They actually took rests from it. And I think sometimes you forget that people like Einstein would go for a walk in the woods, or he would, chat with his wife about things. So like Kathryn was saying, you don't know what the internal life or the domestic life of these people were like. You sort of somehow think that they were buried in their office, and or they had this special way of writing where they lie on the bed and they have the thing tilted up, and or they use this certain pen, and so we project all of their success onto some of their activities, but you forget that they're human beings who found their creative spring from all sorts of sources. So maybe Stjärn's got to go for a walk in the woods or something occasionally, just to to get out of the head and into something more worldly. If it's the world that's being unexciting. And the other thing I was thinking about is, again, something I came across the other day, is I like the idea that the characters are representations of some of the world itself. So let's say you have a city which is very bleak and stark and defined and has a grid-based pattern. Then you can have a character that the main character has to interact with who is also very rigid and very square and very defined. And it's a way of personifying the world. So if you like character more than you like world, one of the ways to think about that is how can I extract the world and make it come alive in character? And that way you don't have to depend so heavily on, your fine brush description of world, because it comes alive in the supporting character cast. You're both nodding.
We're nodding, yes. We're nodding silently. Yeah, I really like the idea of getting out of your writing space, whether it's just to remove your eyes from your computer screen or your journal and to go, walk, think, breathe, or to go experience something that might be somehow similar to your world. One of my friends told me rather excitedly that he had gone out in a blizzard we were having in, shorts and a t-shirt just to stand there and feel how cold it was and see how long he could stand that cold, and then he came back in and it was in service to the scene he was writing where a character had to freeze to death or something. And so, if you're writing about a mountainous village, maybe you travel somewhere where you can hike in a mountain, or, whatever that looks like, visit a lake, whatever approximation you can get to can be a really good way to reinvigorate the passion. You know, bring your senses into it so it's not all in your head. It's not all trying to create something out of your imagination, but you go and create your own experience, you know, sensory experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important not to get lost in the weeds of the world building, and it's very easy in epic fantasy because it is, I suppose, one of the maybe not requirements, but it's an expectation, I think, of the readership that there is some lushness to the way that the world is developed. But there's a real art to doing that, and I've read plenty of fantasy books where it isn't particularly well developed, but they're just wonderful books anyway because of the characters and the magic premise. So I think if your premise is great and you've got an overall arc and your character has got wants and needs, then you know you've got the makings of the story.
And I would not do too much. Like, I would stop before you think you need to stop.
Yeah.
Especially when, I mean, it's so easy to get bogged down and to feel like I just don't know enough. I can't get started. I'm stuck here in this world building, or I'm stuck here in this whatever it is, right? And sometimes the best thing to do is to just start writing that story that excited you in the first place, and then flag things that you need to come back to. And it's okay to not have everything figured out before you start writing. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in what I need that we forget that it's a process, and your first draft is not your only draft, and you will find out what you actually need as you're going along, or your second draft isn't your only draft, you know, depending on how far into it you are. And I think for me, that's one of my biggest stumbling points is I feel like I have to hit so many check boxes before I can continue. And it's like, okay, no, that checkbox can wait. I can get through Act 1, or I can get through this important scene with this character, or this thing that's the thing that's keeping me up at night, right? This is the thing that's exciting me. This is my passion for this project. Just like start working on it so that you can get past the stuck and then come back to the things that are frustrating. So.
Right. And I find keeping my journal in hand along with my research, or you know, whatever that development process entails, is really useful, because then I'm going back and forth. You know, for me, for historical fiction, it's research. For fantasy or sci-fi, it might be choosing that detail in the world building or whatever, but then that triggers an idea for the character or the plot, so I get it down in the journal, and then I go back and forth, and that way there's a mutual feeding happening between the purely creative process and the construction process, you know.
Yeah, and it is all interconnected. And that's why I really like what Robert was saying about moving into a different, maybe, framework, right? Because if you're really stuck in a certain thing, like if you change the way you're looking at it, you can completely change how your brain is thinking about it too. So yeah, moving through and letting it be interwoven together.
I actually think that's one of our incredible human traits that distinguishes us as a species is our ability to adopt other worldviews. And equally, it's one of our biggest frustrations. You know, if you look at the divisive nature of, say, political opinions on Facebook, then you can see that we can easily get stuck. But equally, we've got the capacity. So, you know, why do we watch movies? Why do we read stories? Because we want to vicariously experience things. And so how can we do that unless we can put ourselves in that person's shoes? So, you know, how can we get scared watching a horror movie unless part of our mind is capable of installing itself into that other character? And I think this is one of the things that, as a storyteller, we can forget, because you get caught up in plot or world detail or whatever. And one way to come back to that is to say, well, I can be an actor. In a way, I am the actors, I am the producer, I am the director. So what I can do is I can put on the hat of, you know, the virtual hat of that particular character, whether it's the main character or a supporting character. Now, how are they interacting with that world? What are they experiencing? You know, we've got a common situation at the moment globally as we're recording this, where we have a pandemic. Well, okay, you can say, how will the character experience the pandemic? I know we've done episodes on character development where you can put them in scenarios, but pretend to be that character. What is it about this world that makes it easy or hard or complex or hard to understand, or presents challenges, etc.? So try and look at the world. If it's the world building that's bogging you down, come back to your character again. They're the ones who have to navigate through it, and as human beings we have the capacity to pretend to be somebody else, and that is what you're doing when you're writing a story. So perhaps come back, either be your main character for a while or be a supporting character, and try and get some, again, different feels. So it's a little bit like what Kathryn was saying, breaking the mold, whether it's discussing it with a partner, whether it's using a different model, whether it's bringing in a different tool, whether it's going out to the woods or for a walk or a city or whatever. But I think, trying to break the way that you're perceiving it is going to be your biggest breakthrough there, and that will make it interesting for the readers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty full of it this morning.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you just said, break the way you're perceiving it. And, we've talked about taking a break from your writing desk and changing the way you're relating to the material. But it seems like you were getting at breaking the way the character, with that empathy piece, with putting on our character's hat. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I feel like there's deeper we could go into that piece, like the interplay between plot setting and character. So it isn't just about looking at it differently, but I don't know. Also, my dog is trying to get me to go feed her dinner, so it was a little...
Well, I'll leave you with this one thought then, is in neurolinguistics they talk about something called referential index shift, which is when you shift your point of reference to become the other person, and it's what we all do when we read a story. We become the characters, or when you watch a movie. And so when someone's telling a story that's really boring, it's because you can't become, it's they're relating events. But when the story is really well related, it can be very powerful, and our neurology adopts it. And that's why, if someone's telling a story about how they bit into a really sour lemon, we in part can't help but experience part of that. One of the entire principles of hypnotherapy is to relate stories that affect the deep unconscious and bypass the conscious resistance against these things. And part of our story's theme is buried below, and often we don't know as writers what our theme is either, so we don't know what effect we're having on the reader. And you can try and have an effect consciously, but sometimes that can come across heavy-handed anyway, and the way that readers take things on is different. We were talking off air about Very Good Kind Sword of Truth series, for example. I found the idea of destiny and prophecy and the conflict of that against free will fascinating, and it really captured me for quite a few books. And who knows whether that's what he intended, but the idea that you take something on consciously, but there are parts of it that come through unconsciously, and in hypnotherapy, stories are told deliberately to try and manipulate dysfunctional neurology, or dysfunctional patterns of thinking. And so we're capable of sort of retraining or restructuring our entire models. And I think in part that's what story does. That's why some stories leave us flabbergasted or flawed or emotional in some way, shape or form. And why is that? They're just words on the page. So I think sometimes we get caught up in the setting part and forget that this is about the human experience, and if you can then come back to that and how that impacts on the world, that's to come back to your empathy part, right. Alida, I think that's where it gets really powerful.
Right.
Yeah, so take the parts that you are passionate about, take the parts that you're loving, and use that to get around to the parts that you don't so much.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's fantastic to have to be much more passionate about the characters than it is about the world. I think ultimately you're probably going to find a lot more ease in creating an exciting story that way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unless you want to write travel.
Yes. Yes, unless you're a travel writer. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.